Welcome to the Deep Dive, your way to quickly get up to speed on major global events without drowning in the news cycle. Today, we're really going to unpack two extremely critical geopolitical situations that are, well, dominating the headlines and reshaping global stability right now. We'll be focusing first on the very latest confirmed developments in Ukraine, and second, the escalating tensions involving Iran, Israel, and the United States. And we'll also look at the, frankly, very complicated role Russia seems to be trying to carve out for itself in the Middle East through all this. Now, for this deep dive, we've got quite a stack of recent materials. We're talking fresh geolocated images, official military reports specifically from the Russian Ministry of Defense, and some exclusive interviews.
Yeah, interviews with Russia's ambassador over in the UK, their foreign ministry spokesperson, and also Iran's vice foreign minister. Plus, we have analysis from a Western think tank, Deep State, key reporting from outlets like Bloomberg, The Wall Street Journal, and crucially, we're weaving an essential historical context because, as you'll see, the past really does cast a long shadow here.
Absolutely. And our mission, for you listening, is pretty straightforward. Cut through all that noise. We want to pull out the most important piece of information, pinpoint the really crucial developments, give you the context you need, and highlight the potential ripple effects. The goal is simple.
Yeah.
You walk away from this well-informed quickly on these really critical global events.
Okay, so the global chessboard is set. Let's zoom in first on Ukraine. What's the latest ground truth there? Are we seeing, a real shift on the front lines?
We are definitely seeing significant activity, and importantly, some of it is backed by solid evidence. Geolocated images published very recently confirm Russian forces have advanced north of Sumy, that's in the Kharkiv region, and they've also pushed into part of the Vovchansk aggregate plant, also north of Kharkiv. These were observed just June 17th, 18th. We're also seeing suggestions, signs that Russian troops might have captured the small settlement of Stupachki, which is south of Chasiv. Now, alongside that, the Russian Ministry of Defense has claimed they've taken Novonikolayevka in Donetsk. But it's really important to stress here these specific claims about Novonikolayevka. They aren't confirmed by Kyiv or by independent geolocated images. So, we need to approach that particular claim with some caution, as the sources note.
Right. Caution noted. It sounds like, at least from their perspective, Russia is pushing on several fronts. Can you give us a sense of the units involved and what kind of impact they're claiming?
Sure. The Russian MOD reports mention specific formations. There's the Battle Group Center, which has been very active in the Donetsk area, and then Battle Group North seems to be leading the push in the Sumy region, and also near places called Udi and Ryzenkovo, closer to the Kyiv front direction. According to these Russian reports, these groups have inflicted losses on 8 different Ukrainian units. That includes, 3 mechanized brigades, 1 air assault, 1 light infantry, 2 Marine brigades, and 1 National Guard brigade. But again, I have to emphasize these detailed reports, especially the casualty figures, come directly from the Russian Ministry of Defense. They haven't been independently verified.
Okay, so the ground reports paint a picture of Russian confidence. How does that translate, though, to the diplomatic side? Are their demands really set in stone, or is there maybe some wiggle room behind the tough talk?
Well, looking at the diplomacy, Russia's stance seems remarkably firm, very consistent. Andrei Kylin, he's Russia's ambassador to the UK, he said in a CNN interview, pretty bluntly, that Ukraine basically has 2 options: accept Moscow's terms or face more military pressure and ultimately surrender. He really asserted that Russia is gaining ground and sees absolutely no reason strategically to stop their operations right now. He even threw out a number, claiming Russia took about 600 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory just in May.
Wow, 600 square kilometers. That's a huge claim. How does that compare to what independent analysts are seeing? Is there a big gap there?
That's the key question, isn't it? The Western think tank Deep State, they track these things pretty closely. Their analysis suggests Russia occupied approximately 449 square kilometers in May. Now, that's lower than Kylin's figure, obviously, but it's still the largest single monthly advance this year. So it does underscore the scale of recent Russian movements and lends some weight to this idea of Russian momentum.
So even the more conservative number shows significant gains. Okay, what exactly are these non-negotiable terms that Russia's putting forward?
Kylin laid them out quite clearly. First, recognition of Russia's annexation of Crimea, Kherson, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Luhansk, all 5. Second, a complete withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from all those areas. And third, Ukraine must accept neutral status. That means formally renouncing any future bid to join NATO. Interestingly, Kylin tried to frame these not as, surrender terms, but as steps in a diplomatic process. He pointed to things like past prisoner exchanges as examples of, in his view, diplomatic progress.
Steps in a process. That brings up the question of sustainability, right? Kalin's figures on Russia's budget spend and recruitment. They sound almost too good to be true for Moscow. Is there anything challenging that view?
From the official Russian perspective presented by Kilin, no, they paint a picture of complete sustainability. He claimed Russia is only spending 5 to 7% of its national budget on the conflict, and he asserted they're recruiting up to 60,000 volunteers every month. Now, our sources don't directly refute those exact numbers, but the sheer scale of this war does make you look twice at figures like that low-budget percentage. What it really tells us is Moscow believes, or at least projects the belief, that they have the resources and the momentum to keep going for a long time.
So when you step back and try to make sense of all this for our listeners, what's the big picture takeaway from the Ukraine situation right now?
Look, what it reveals is that Russia isn't just fighting a tactical war in Ukraine. They seem to be pursuing a much longer game, a strategy aimed at fundamentally challenging the post-Cold War order in Europe. This suggests that any quick diplomatic fixes are probably unlikely. The real impact, the deep impact, is likely to be in how global alliances shift and how nations rethink their security for years, maybe decades to come.
Okay, let's shift focus now to another incredibly volatile region, the Middle East. Tensions are really ratcheting up between Iran, Israel, the U.S. What are we hearing about potential U.S. intervention, and how is Russia reacting?
Well, the reaction from Russia was swift and pretty sharp. Maria Zakharova, the foreign ministry spokesperson, used the platform of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum to issue a very strong warning. She cautioned Washington directly against any military intervention, calling it an extremely dangerous step with truly unpredictable negative consequences.
And Russia isn't just warning, right? They seem to be trying to position themselves as some kind of diplomatic bridge, a mediator almost. What are they actually doing, and what's their stake in this? Why are they getting involved?
That's exactly right. Moscow is actively trying to prevent things from escalating further. They're pushing for a ceasefire, for negotiations. President Putin himself has apparently been on the phone with leaders in both Israel and Iran, also with former President Trump, Turkey, the UAE, and Foreign Minister Lavrov. He's been talking to his counterparts in Iran, Turkey, Egypt, Oman, Azerbaijan, Indonesia, quite a list. Russia's interest here is pretty clear. They've said it themselves. They strongly oppose regime change in Iran. They see that as a huge potential setback for their interests, maybe even worse than what they saw happen in Syria. So they're advocating for a negotiated solution, one based on, international law, balancing interests, and what they often call equal and indivisible security. Zakharova also mentioned Russia supports Iran's reported willingness to stick to the nuclear non-proliferation treaty and even restart dialogue with the U.S., but only if Israeli attacks stop.
It's certainly interesting seeing Russia play that role, especially when we're getting these contradictory signals from inside the U.S. about potential action against Iran. What are those signals, and what's the reaction been like domestically in the U.S.?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mixed bag, really. Bloomberg reported that Washington is making preparations for a possible attack on Iran, maybe in the coming days, though no final decision seems to have been made. And then the Wall Street Journal revealed that Trump actually approved an attack plan back on June 17th. Now, no order to execute was given, but the idea, according to his advisors, was to pressure Tehran over his nuclear program. But this hasn't gone down well everywhere in the U.S. There's actually significant pushback from within the Make America Great Again movement itself. Figures like Tucker Carlson, Steve Bannon, they have reacted quite negatively to the idea of a full-blown war with Iran. Carlson was very direct, saying something like, "You don't want to convince me that the Iranian people are my enemy."
That internal dissent is really worth noting. Okay, let's turn to Israel. Their current operation is called Operation Rising Lion. What are their stated goals, and what's the significance of that name? It sounds loaded with history.
It really is. Netanyahu's stated objective is, first, to force Tehran to completely abandon uranium enrichment and its ballistic missile program, and also to stop its support for armed groups across the Middle East. But there seems to be a deeper strategy, too, trying to exhaust the Iranian regime's ability to project power and also maintain its own internal cohesion. That includes hitting things like government buildings and state media inside Iran. Now, the name Operation Rising Lion is packed with symbolism. The lion with the sun was a very prominent symbol of Iran before the 1979 revolution, especially under the Pahlavi dynasty. This imagery even popped up recently in an Israeli government post in Farsi, showing a lion with a sword piercing the current Islamic Republic flag. It also connects to the historical link of the lion to the tribe of Judah, and it's on Jerusalem's coat of arms.
That historical connection is fascinating, especially thinking about past interventions. How critical is that history, specifically the 1953 coup, to understanding Iran's stance today?
Oh, it's absolutely fundamental. You have to understand, the West has intervened to change Iran's government before, with massive long-term consequences. Back in 1953, Iran's democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, nationalized the oil industry, taking control from a British company. This led directly to a covert operation by the CIA and Britain's MI6, codenamed Operation Ajax, which overthrew Mossadegh. They brought the Shah back, backed by the U.S., and he established an authoritarian regime that lasted until it was overthrown in the 1979 Islamic Revolution. So this history means any talk of external pressure or regime change today lands on very fertile ground for suspicion and resistance inside Iran. Expecting Iranians to just embrace messages calling for change, especially when those messages are associated with a declared enemy like Israel, really underestimates that historical memory and, frankly, Iranian national pride.
Right. It's not happening in a vacuum.
Not at all. And Iran's response right now has been absolutely defiant. Supreme Leader Khamenei flatly rejected Trump's call for unconditional surrender. He stated the nation will never surrender and warned U.S. intervention would cause irreparable damage. Trump's public response to that, just good luck. Meanwhile, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard claims they launched a new wave of attacks combined missile and drone strikes targeting military and defense sites in Haifa and Tel Aviv. They mentioned over 100 drones and said missile attacks would ramp up. And Abbas Araghchi, Iran's vice foreign minister, claimed an Iranian missile hit an Israeli command center near Soroka Hospital in southern Israel. He did clarify the hospital itself only had superficial damage and is mainly used for soldiers, but he accused Israel of starting the bloodshed and targeting civilians. On the other side, you had Netanyahu visiting that same Soroka Hospital, talking about the collective pain of Israelis, mentioning deaths, and even sharing that his own son's wedding had to be canceled again because of the missile threat. It brings the human cost into sharp focus.
It really does.
Yeah.
So thinking about that deep history, Operation Ajax specifically, what does it tell us about how effective external pressure campaigns are likely to be against Iran today?
Well, what it strongly suggests is that predicting simple outcomes like an imminent regime collapse is probably wishful thinking. It overlooks just how complex Iran is historically, culturally, internally. History, especially that history, warns us that external interventions often create more problems than they solve, spawning unintended consequences that can last for generations.
So let's talk broader implications. You mentioned Iran's defiance. What about its resilience? Is the regime really as fragile as some might hope?
That's a key question. And there are factors suggesting maybe not, or at least more resilience than expected. First, this conflict seems to be dragging on longer than perhaps Tel Aviv anticipated. Iran can still evidently hit targets inside Israel, which is a small, densely populated country. Second, Iran's a big country, 90 million people, very diverse ethnically. And so far, we're not seeing signs of massive, widespread protests demanding regime change. Third, the Revolutionary Guard. They seem cohesive, around 250,000 strong, deeply embedded in the state. Some analysts suggest the real power might even rest with them now, not necessarily the aging supreme leader Khamenei. And think about this. Targeting Khamenei, Trump kind of hinted at it, saying, we know where he is, we won't kill him for now. That could easily backfire. It could create a martyr figure, spark huge backlash, and might not even topple the regime structure itself. In fact, many experienced strategists, people who know the region well, they worry that if this regime falls, what comes next could actually be even worse. Maybe some kind of Islamic Revolutionary Guard republic, not the Western-style democracy some might envision.
But despite that resilience, you also mentioned Iran seems more isolated. Its traditional alliances look shaky.
That's the paradox, yes. It's quite accurate to say Iran appears more isolated than ever. Its strategy of using proxy forces across the region has taken some serious hits lately. And what's really noticeable is the relative silence from its big traditional allies, Russia and China. They're making statements, sure, but perhaps not the full-throated support Iran might have hoped for. And then you have countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Publicly, they condemn Israeli actions, but behind the scenes, they don't seem too upset about seeing their regional rival, Shiite Iran, weakened, especially given past Iranian attacks on Gulf infrastructure.
So isolation on one hand, but internal resilience on the other. What about the nightmare scenario? What if Iran does collapse internally? What are the risks then?
The risks are potentially catastrophic, and that's what has many strategists deeply concerned. An internal collapse could easily inflame tensions among Iran's many ethnic and religious minorities. We're talking Arabs, Kurds, Azeris, Baluchs, Baha'is, Christians. You could see an unprecedented internal conflict ignite. and a destabilized, fragmenting Iran. That could act like a fire accelerant across the entire region, from Azerbaijan all the way to Pakistan. It could destabilize states that are already quite fragile. That's the fear of regional implosion.
That's a sobering thought. When you talk about the risks of collapse potentially being worse than the current situation, what's the most crucial thing for our listeners to grasp about that?
I think the critical takeaway for you listening is this. Sometimes, the West seems to suffer from a kind of historical amnesia, especially regarding things like Operation AX. And this failure to fully reckon with that past inadvertently fuels Iran's narrative of grievance, its deep distrust, its nationalism. Any strategy, any pressure campaign that doesn't account for that deep historical scar risks not only failing, but potentially strengthening the very hardliners it aims to weaken, and possibly paving the way for something even more unstable and dangerous. The unknown unknowns are huge here.
Okay, so let's quickly recap our deep dive today. We've covered two really critical global flashpoints. First, the situation in Ukraine, ongoing Russian tactical gains on the ground, coupled with a firm diplomatic stance and non-negotiable demands. And second, the incredibly complex, historically charged escalation involving Iran, Israel, and the U.S. We saw Russia attempting to act as a diplomatic player, while tensions remain sky-high amid warnings and military posturing.
Exactly. And both situations really highlight this incredibly tangled web of geopolitics, national interests, deep historical grievances, and the sheer unpredictability of military actions and diplomatic chess moves. What the sources consistently show is that easy answers or simplistic solutions rarely work. They often ignore the deeper complexities and almost always carry unforeseen, sometimes dangerous consequences.
Which leaves us with one final thought for you to consider. What does that history we discussed, specifically the 1953 Operation Ajax in Iran, really teach us about the long-term effectiveness or ineffectiveness, and especially the unintended consequences of external interventions aimed at changing regimes, particularly in regions as culturally complex and strategically vital as the Middle East? Something to chew on.